They decide, they describe the Boston rich, living sumptuously on Beacon Hill, admired by their neighbors for their philanthropy and their patronage of art and culture. These men traded in State Street while overseers ran their factories, managers directed the railroads, agents sold their water power and real estate. They were absentee landlords, in the most complete sense, uncontaminated by the disease of the factory town. They were also protected from hearing the complaints of their workers, or suffering mental depression from dismissal and squalid surroundings. In the metropolis, art, literature, education, science flowered in the golden day. In the industrial towns, children went to work with their fathers and mothers. Schools and doctors were only promises. A bed of one's own was a rare luxury. Ralph Waldo Emerson described Boston in these years, quote, "There is a certain poor smell in all the streets, and Beacon Street and Mount Vernon, as well as in lawyers' offices, and the wharves, and the same meanness and sterility, and leave all hope behind, as one finds in a boot manufacturer's premises." End quote. The preacher Theodore Parker told his congregation, quote, "Money is this day the strongest power of the nation." End quote. The attempts at political stability and economic control did not quite workers. The new industrialism, the crowded cities, the long hours in the factories, the sudden economic crises leading to high prices and lost jobs, the lack of food and water, the freezing winters, the hot tenements in the summer, the epidemics of disease, the deaths of children, these led to sporadic reactions from the poor. Sometimes there were spontaneous, unorganized uprisings against the rich. Sometimes the anger was deflected into racial hatred of blacks, religious warfare against Catholics, nativist fury against immigrants. Sometimes it was organized into demonstrations and strikes. Quote, Jacksonian democracy, unquote, had tried to create consensus of support for the system to make it secure. Blacks, Indians, women, and foreigners were clearly outside this consensus. But also white working people in large numbers declared themselves outside. The full extent of the working class consciousness of those years, as at any year, is lost in history. But fragments remain and make us wonder how much of this always existed underneath the very practical silence of working people. In 1827, end quote, address before the mechanics and working classes of Philadelphia, end quote, was recorded written by an, quote, unlettered mechanic, end quote, probably a young shoemaker who said, "We find ourselves oppressed on every hand. We labor hard in producing all the comforts of life for the enjoyment of others, while we ourselves attain but a scanty portion, even that in the present state of society depends on the will of employers." Frances Rhett of Scotland, an early feminist and utopian socialist, was invited by Philadelphia workingmen to speak on the 4th of July to one of the first citywide associations of labor unions in the United States. She asked if the revolution had been fought, quote, to crush down the sons and daughters of your country's industry under neglect, poverty, vice, starvation, and disease, end quote. She wondered the new technology was not lowering the value of human labor, making people appendages to machines, crippling the minds and bodies of child laborers. Later that year, George Henry Evans, a printer-editor of the Working Man's Advocate, wrote, quote, "The Working Man's Declaration of Independence," end quote, among its list of, quote, facts submitted to, quote, candid and impartial, end quote, fellow citizens. Number 1. The laws for levying taxes are operating most oppressively on one class of society. Number 3. The laws for private incorporation are all partial, favoring one class of society to the expense of the other. And number 6. The laws have deprived 9/10 of the members of the body, politics, who are now wealthy, of the equal means to enjoy, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Lien Law in favor of the landlords against tenants is one illustration among innumerable others. Evans believed that all, on arriving at adult age, are entitled to equal property. A citywide, quote, trades union in Boston 1834, including mechanics from Charlestown and women shoebinders from Lynn, referred to the Declaration of Independence. "We hold that the laws which have a tendency to raise any peculiar class above their fellow citizens by granting special privileges are contrary to and in defiance of those primary principles. Our public system of education, which so liberally endows those seminaries of learning which are only accessible to the wealthy, while our common schools are so illy provided for. Thus, even in childhoods, for poor are adapted to think for themselves inferior. In this book, Most Uncommon Jacksonians, Edward Pessin says, quote, the leaders of the Jacksonian labor movement were radicals. Howells described men who believed American society to be torn with socially conflict, disfigured by the misery of the masses, and dominated by a greedy elite whose power over every aspect of American life was based on private property. Episodes of insurrection of that time had gone unrecorded in traditional histories, such as the riot in Baltimore in the summer of 1835, when the Bank of Maryland collapsed and its depositors lost their savings. That'll happen again. Convinced that a great fraud had taken place, a crowd gathered and began breaking the windows of officials associated with the bank. When the rioters destroyed a house, the militia attacked, killing some 20 people, wounding 100. The next evening, other houses were attacked. The events were reported in Niles' Weekly Register, an important newspaper of that time. Last night, Sunday, at dark, the attack was renewed upon Reverdy Johnson's house. There was now no opposition. It was supposed that several thousand people were spectators of the scene. The house was soon entered, and its furniture a very extensive law library, and all its contents were cast forth, a bonfire made of them in front of the house. The whole interior of the house was torn out and cast upon the burning pile. The marble portico in front and a great portion of the front wall were torn down by about 11 o'clock. They proceeded that to that of the mayor of the city, Jesse Hunt, Esquire, broke it open, took out the furniture, and burned it before the door. So, during those years, trade unions were forming. Phillips Fauner's History of the Labor Movement in the U.S. tells the story in rich detail. The courts called them conspiracies to restrain trade and therefore illegal. As when in New York, 25 members of the Union Society of Journeymen tailors were found guilty of, quote, conspiracy of injured trade, riot, assault, and battery, end quote. The judge, levying fines, said, quote, in this favored land of law and liberty, the road to advancement is open to all. Every American knows that, or ought to know, that he has no better friend than the laws, that he needs no artificial combination for his protection. They are of foreign origin, and I am led to believe mainly upheld by foreigners, end quote. A handbill was then circulated throughout the city. The rich against the poor. So Judge Edwards, the tool of the aristocracy, against the people. Mechanics and working men. A deadly blow has been struck at your liberty. They have established the precedent that working men have no rights to regulate the price of labor, or in other words, the rich are the only judges of the wants of the poor man. At City Hall Park, 27,000 people gathered to denounce the court's decision and elected a committee of correspondence which organized 3 months later a convention of mechanics, farmers, working men, elected farmers, and working people in various towns in New York State. The convention met in Utica, drew up a declaration of independence from existing political parties, and established an equal rights party. Although they ran their own candidates for office, there was no great confidence in the ballot as a way of achieving change. One of the great orators of the movement, Seth Luther, told a 4th of July rally, quote, we will try the ballot box first. If that will not affect our righteous purpose, the next and last resort is the cartage box, end quote. And one sympathetic local newspaper, the Albany Microscope, warned, remember the regretted fate of the working men. They were soon destroyed by hitching teams and rolling with parties. They admitted into the ranks broken down layers and politicians. They became perverted and were unconsciously drawn into a vortex from which they never escaped. The crisis of 1837 led to rallies and meetings in many cities. The banks had been suspended, specie-time payments, refusing to pay hard money for the bank notes they had issued. Prices rose, and working people, already hard-pressed to buy food, found that flour that had sold at $5.62 a barrel was now $12. Pork went up, coal went up. In Philadelphia, 20,000 assembled, and someone wrote to President Van Buren describing it. This afternoon, the largest public meeting I ever saw, assembled in Independence Square. It was called by placards posted throughout the city yesterday and last night. It was projected and carried on entirely by the working class, without consolation or cooperation, without any of those who usually tailed the lead in such matters. The officers and speakers worked out of the classes. It was directed against the banks. In New York, members of the Equal Rights Party, often called the local focos, announced a meeting, quote, bread, meat, rent, and fuel. Their prices must come down. The people will meet in the park, rain or shine, at 4 o'clock p.m. on Monday afternoon. All friends of humanity determined to resist monopolists and extortioners are invited to attend. End quote. The Commercial Register, a New York newspaper, reported on the meeting and what followed. Here I have today is a bottle of Irish bourbon cream. This stuff is actually really good. For those who have not tried it, I recommend it. I believe this is only sold in the United States, as far as I'm concerned. Whether or not it is worth a try, I do like it. It straight up looks like fucking chocolate milk, but it tastes nothing like it. But it's actually not bad. For those who are fans of bourbon and love old fashions or other kinds of whiskey, I would highly recommend drinking something like this. If you couldn't read it, it comes from a company called Buffalo Trace Distillery. Moisten up the palate. Oh. At 4 o'clock, a concourse of several thousands had convened in front of the city hall. One of these orators is reported to have expressly directed the popular vengeance against Mr. Ellicott, who was one of our most extensive flour dealers on commission. Quote, fellow citizens, he exclaimed, quote, Mr. Hart has now 53,000 barrels of flour in his store. Let us go offer him $8 a barrel, and he does not take it. A large body of the meeting moved off in the direction of Mr. Hart's store. The middle door had been forced, and some 20 or 30 barrels of flour or more rolled into the streets, and the head staved in. At this point of time, Mr. Hart himself arrived on the ground with a posse of officers from the police. The officers were assailed by a portion of the mob in Day Street. Their staves wrestled from them and shivered to pieces. Barrels of flour by dozens, 50s, and hundreds were tumbled into the street from the doors and thrown into rapid succession from the windows. About 1,000 bushels of wheat and 4 or 500 barrels of flour were thus wantonly and foolishly as well as wickedly destroyed. The most active of the destructioners were foreigners. Indeed, the greater part of the assemblage was of exotic origin. But there were probably 500 or 1,000 others standing by and abetting their incendiary labors. Amidst the falling and bursting of the barrels and sacks of wheat, numbers of women were engaged, like the crones who stripped the dead in battle, filling the boxes and baskets with which they were provided, and their aprons in flour, and making off with it. Night had closed upon the scene, but the work of destruction did not cease, until strong bodies of police arrived, followed soon afterward by detachments of troops. And by troops, they mean the military. This was the flour riot of 1837. During the crisis that year, 50,000 persons, 1/3 of the working class, were without working in New York City alone, and 200,000 of a population of 500,000 were living, as one observer put it, quote, in utter and hopeless distress. End quote. There is no complete record of the meetings, riots, actions, organized and disorganized, violent and nonviolent, which took place in the mid-19th century. As the country grew, as the cities became crowded, with working conditions bad, living conditions intolerable, with the economy in the hands of bankers, speculators, landlords, and merchants. In 1835, 50 different trades organized unions in late Philadelphia, and there was a successful general strike of laborers, factory workers, bookbinders, jewelers, coal heavers, butchers, and cabinet workers for the 10-hour day. Soon there were 10-hour laws in Pennsylvania and other states, but they provided that employers could have employees sign contracts for longer hours, now known as overtime. It was pretended that work contracts were voluntary agreements between equals. It's not. Weavers in Philadelphia in the early 1840s, mostly Irish immigrants working at home for employers, struck for higher wages, attacked the homes of those refusing to strike, and destroyed their work. A sheriff's posée tried to arrest some strikers, but it was broken up by 400 weavers, and armed with muskets and sticks. Soon, however, antagonism developed between these Irish Catholic weavers and native-born Protestant skilled workers over the issue of religion. In May 1844, there were Protestant Catholic riots in Kensington, a suburb of Philadelphia. Nativist anti-immigrant rioters destroyed the weavers, neighborhoods, and attacked the Catholic Church. Middle-class politicians soon led each group into a different political party, the Nativists in the American Republican Party, and the Irish into the Democratic Party. Party politics and religion now substituting for class conflict. The result of this, says David Montgomery, historian of the Kensington riots, was the fragmentation of the Philadelphia working class. Quote, it thereby created for historians the illusion of a society lacking in class conflict, end quote, while in reality the class conflicts of 19th century America, quote, were as fierce as any known to the industrial world, end quote. The immigrants from Ireland, fleeing starvation there when the potato crop failed, were coming to America now, packed into old sailing ships. The stories of these ships differ only in detail from the accounts of the ships that earlier brought back slaves, and later German, Indian, and Russian immigrants. This is a contemporary account of one ship arriving from Ireland, detained at Grosse Isle on the Canadian border. On the 18th of May, 1847, the, quote, Urania, from Cork, with several hundred immigrants on board, a large proportion of them sick and dying of the ship fever, was put into quarantine at Grosse Isle. This was the first of the plague-smitten ships from Ireland which that year sailed up to the St. Lawrence. But before the first week of June, as many as 84 ships, various tonnage were driven in by an easterly wind, and that of the enormous number of vessels, there was not one free from the taint of malignant typhus. The offspring of famine and of the foul ship hold, a tolerable quick passage occupied from 6 to 8 weeks. Who can imagine the horrors of even the shortest passage in an emigrant ship, crowded beyond its almost capacity of stowage with unhappy beings of all ages, with fever raging in the midst? The crew sullen, are brutal from bare desperation, are paralyzed with terror of the plague. The miserable passengers unable to help themselves or afford the least relief, and to each other 1/4, 1/3, 1/2 the entire number and different ages of the disease, many dying, some dead, the fatal poison intensified by the indescribable foulness of the air breathed and rebreathed by the gasping sufferers. The wails of children, the ravings of the delirious, the cries and groans of those in mortal agony. There was no accommodation of any kind on the isle. Sheds were rapidly filled with the miserable people. Hundreds were literally flung on the beach, left amid the mud and stone to crawl on the dry land how they could. Many of these gasped out their last breath on the fatal shore, not able to drag themselves from the slime in which they lay. It was not until the 1st November that the quarantine of Grosse Isle was closed. Upon that barren isle, as many as 10,000 of the Irish race were consigned to the grave pit. How could these new Irish immigrants, themselves poor and despised, become sympathizers with the black slave, who was becoming more and more the center of attention, the subject of agitation in the country? Indeed, most working-class activists at this time ignored the plight of blacks. Eli Moore, a New York trade union leader, to Congress, argued in the House of Representatives against receiving abolitionist petitions. Race hostility became an easy substitute for class frustration. On the other hand, a white shoemaker wrote in 1848 in the All and newspaper of Lynn Shoe Factory workers, "We are nothing but a standing army that keeps the 3 million of our brethren in bondage." Living under the shade of Bunker Hill Monument, demanding in the name of humanity our right and withholding those rights from others because their skin is black. It is any wonder that God, in his religious anger, has punished us by forcing us to drink the bitter cup of degradation. It's a very powerful wordage in this book, especially in this chapter. The anger of the city, poor, often expressed itself in a futile violence or nationality or religion. In New York in 1849, a mob, largely Irish, stormed the fashionable Oyster Place Opera House where an English actor, William Charles Macready, was playing Macbeth, in competition with an American actor, Edwin Forrest, who was acting the same role in another production. The crowd shouting, quote, "Burn the damned den of aristocracy," unquote. Charging, throwing bricks, the militia were called out, and in the violence that followed, about 200 people were killed or wounded. Another economic crisis came in 1857. The boom in railroads and in manufacturing, the surge of immigration, the increased speculation in stocks and bonds, the stealing, corruption, and manipulation led to wild expansion and then crash. By October that year, 200,000 were unemployed, and thousands of recent immigrants crowded into the eastern ports, hoping to work their way back to Europe. The New York Times reported, quote, "Every ship for Liverpool now has all the passengers she can carry, and multitudes are applying to the work their passenger. They have nobody to pay for it." In New York, New Jersey, a rally of several thousand demanded that the city give work to unemployed, and in New York, 50,000 city people met at Tompkins Square in downtown Manhattan. From there, they marched to Wall Street and paraded around the stock exchange, shouting, quote, "We want work," end quote. That summer, riots occurred in the slum areas of New York, and a mob of 500 attacked the police one day with pistols and bricks. There were parades of the unemployed demanding bread and work, looting shops. In November, a crowd occupied City Hall, and the U.S. Marines were brought in to drive them out. Of the country's workforce, 6 million in 1850, 500,000 were women, 330,000 were just domestics, and 55,000 were teachers. Of the 181,000 women in factories, half worked in textile mills. They organized women struck by themselves for the first time in 1825. They were the United Tailoresses of New York, demanding higher wages. In 1829, the first strike of male and women on their own took place in Detroit and Denver and Dover, New Hampshire. When several hundred women paraded with banners and flags, they shot off gunpowder and protested against new factory rules, which charged fines for coming later, forbade talking on the job, and required church attendance. They were forced to return to the mill, their demands unmet, and their leaders were fired and blacklisted. In Exeter, New Hampshire, women mill workers went on strike, quote, "turned out" in the language of that day, because the overseer was setting the clocks back to get more time from them. They strike succeeded in exacting a promise from the company that the overseers would set their watches right. The, quote, Lowell system, in which young girls would go to work in the mills and live in dormitories supervised by matrons, at first seemed beneficent, sociable, a welcome escape from household drudgery or domestic service. Lowell, Massachusetts, was the first town created for the textile mill industry. It was named after the wealthy and influential Lowell family, but the dormitories became prison-like, controlled by rules and religion and regulations. The supper, served after the women had risen at 4 a.m. and worked until 7:30 in the evening, often consisted merely of bread and gravy. So the Lowell girls organized. They started their own newspapers. They protested against the weaving rooms, which were poorly lit, badly ventilated, and possibly hot in the summer, damp and cold in the winter. In 1834, a cut in wages led the Lowell women to strike, proclaiming, quote, "Union is power. Our present object is to have union exertion, and where we remain in possession of our own questionable rights." But the threat of hiring others to replace them brought them back to work and reduced wages. The leaders were fired. And now you're seeing that with Starbucks and Amazon. The young women, determined to do better next time, organized a Factory Girls Association, and 1,500 women went on strike in 1836 against a raise and border housing charges. Harriet Hansen was an 11-year-old girl working the mill, she later recalled. I worked in a lower room where I had heard the proposed strike fully, if not vehemently discussed, had I been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempt at oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally I took sides with the strikers. When the day came on which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper room started first, and so many of them left, that our mill was at once shut down. Then, when the girls in my room stood irresolute, uncertain what to do, I, who began to think they would not go out after all their talk, became impatient, and started on ahead, saying, with childish bravado, I don't care what you do, I'm not going to turn out. I am going to turn out, whether anyone else does or not. Unquote. I marched out and was followed by the others. As I look back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I have ever been since. The strikers marched through the streets of Lowell singing. They held out a month, but then their money ran out, they were evicted from their boarding houses, and many of them went back to work. The leaders were fired, including Harry Hansen's widowed mother, a matron in the hoarding house, who was blamed for her child's going out on strike. Resistance continued. One mill in Lowell, Herbert Gutman reports, discharged 28 women for such reasons as, quote, misconduct, quote, disobedience, quote, impudence, quote, levity, and quote, mutiny. Meanwhile, the girls tried to hold on to the thoughts about fresh air, the country, a less harried way of life. One of them recalled, quote, I never cared much for machinery. I could not see into their complications or feel interested in them. In sweet June weather, I would lean far out the window and try not to hear the unceasing clash of sounds inside. In New Hampshire, 500 men and women petitioned the Almuskeag Manufacturing Company not to cut down an elm tree. To make space for another mill. They said it was, quote, a beautiful and goodly tree, end quote, representing a time, quote, when the yell of the red man and the scream of the eagle were alone, heard on the banks of the Merrimack, instead of twin giant edifices filled with the buzz of busy and well-remunerated industry, end quote. In 1835, 20 mills went on to strike to reduce the workday from 13 and half an hours to 11 hours, to get cash wages instead of company script, and to end fines for lateness. 1,500 children and parents went on strike, and it lasted 6 weeks. Strike bearers were brought in, and some workers went back to work. But the strikers did win a 12-hour workday and 9 hours on Saturday. That year and the next, there were 140 strikers in the eastern part of the United States. The crisis that followed, the 1837 panic, stimulated the formation in 1845 of the Female Labor Reform Association in Lowell, which sent thousands of petitions to the Massachusetts legislature, asking for a 10-hour day. The finally legislature decided to hold public hearings, the first investigation of labor conditions by any governmental body in the country. Eliza Hemingway told the committee of the air thick, with smoke from the oil lamps burning before sunup and after sundown. Judith Payne told of her sickness due to the work in the mills, but after the committee visited the mills for which the company prepared it by a cleanup job, it reported, quote, your committee returned fully satisfied that the order, decorum, and general appearance of things and in around the mills could not be improved by any suggestion of theirs or by any act of the legislature, end quote. The report was denounced by the Female Labor Reform Association, and they worked successfully for the committee chairman's a defeat at the next election, though they could not vote, but not much was done. Changed conditions in the mills. In the late 1840s, the New England farm women who worked in the mills began to lead them, as many more immigrants from Ireland took their place. Company towns now grew up around mills in Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, using workers who signed contracts pledging everyone in the family to work for a year. They lived in slum tenements owned by the company, were paid in script, which they could use only at company stores, and were evicted if their work was unsatisfactory. In Paterson, New Jersey, the first of series of mill strikes started by children when the company suddenly put off their diner hour from noon to 1 p.m. The children marched off the job, their parents cheered them on, they were joined by other working people in the town, carpenters, masons, and machinists, who turned the strike into a 10-hour day struggle. After a week, however, with the threat of bringing the militia, the children returned to work, and the leaders were fired. Soon after, trying to prevent more trouble, the company restored the noon dinner hour. It was the shoemakers of Lynn, Massachusetts, a factory town north of Boston. who started the largest strike to take place in the United States before the Civil War. Lynn had pioneered in the use of sewing machines in factories, replacing shoemaker artisans, the factory workers in Lynn, who began to organize in the 1830s, later starting a militant newspaper, the All. 1944, 4 years later, 4 years before Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto appeared, the All wrote, "The division of society into the producing and non-producing classes and the fact of the unequal distribution of value between the two introduces us at once to another distinction, that of capital and labor. Labor now becomes a commodity. Antagonism and opposition of interest is introduced, and the community, capital and labor, stand opposed." The economic crisis of 1857 brought the shoe business to a halt, and the workers of Lynn lost their jobs. There was already already anger at the machine stitching replacement shoemakers. Prices were up, wages were reportedly cut, and by the fall of 1859, men were earning $3 a week and women were earning $1 a week, working 16 hours a day. In early 1860, a mass meeting of the newly formed Mechanics Association demanded higher wages. When the manufacturers refused to meet with their committees, the workers called a strike for Washington's birthday. That morning, 3,000 shoemakers met in the Lyceum Hall in Lynn and set up committees of 100 posts, the name of scabs, to guard against violence, to make sure shoes would not be sent out to be finished elsewhere. Now, for those who know, scabs means these are untrained workers who are hired to take the place of the trained workers. That's what scabs are. In a few days, shoe workers throughout New England joined the strike in Natick, Newburyport, Haverhill, Marblehead, and other Massachusetts towns, as well as towns in New Hampshire and Maine. In a week, strikes had begun in all the shoe towns of New England, and with mechanics associations of 25 towns and 20,000 shoe workers on strike, newspapers called it, quote, "the revolution at the North," quote, "the rebellion among the workmen of New England," and, quote, "beginning of the conflict between capital and labor." 1,000 and 5,000 men marched through the streets of Lynn in the blizzard, carrying banners and American flags. Women, shoebinders, and stitchers joined the strike and held their own mass meeting. A New York Herald reporter wrote of them, quote, "They assail the bosses in a style which reminds me one of the amiable females who participated in the first French Revolution," end quote. A huge ladies' procession was organized, the women marching through streets high, with snowdrifts carrying signs, quote, "American ladies will not be slaves. Weak in physical strength, but strong in moral courage. We dare battle for the right shoulder to shoulder with our fathers, husbands, and brothers," end quote. 10 days after that, a procession of 10,000 striking workers, including delegations from Salem, Marblehead, and other towns, men and women, marched through Lynn in what was the greatest demonstration of labor to take place in New England up to that time. Police from Boston and militia were sent to make sure strikers did not interfere with shipments of shoes to be finished at the sale. The strike processions went on, while city grocers and provision dealers provided food for the strikers. The strike continued through March with morale high, but by April it was losing force. The manufacturers offered higher wages to bring the strikers back into the factories, but without recognizing the unions, so that the workers still had to face the employer as individuals. Most of the shoe workers were native-born Americans, Alan Dawley says in a study of the Lynn strike, class and community. They did not accept the social and political order that kept them in poverty, however much it was praised in American schools, churches, newspapers, and Lynn. He says, quote, "Articulate activist Irish shoe and leather workers joined Yankees in flatly rejecting the myth of success. Irish and Yankee workers jointly looked for labor candidates when they tried to the polls, and resisted strike breaking by local police," end quote. To understand why this fierce class spirit did not lead to independent revolutionary political action, Dawley concludes that the main reason is that electoral politics drained the energies of their sisters into the channels of the system, which is what's happening now, but hopefully that doesn't happen. Dawley disputes some historians who have said that high rate of mobility of workers prevented them from organizing revolutionary ways. He says that while there was a high turnover in Lynn, too, with this, quote, "mass existence of a virtually permanent minority who played the key role in organizing discontent," end quote. He also suggests that mobility helps people set that others are in similar conditions. He thinks the struggle of European workers for political democracy, even while they sought economic equality, made them, quote, "class conscious." American workers, however, had already gained political democracy by the 1830s. Until their economic battles could be taken over by political parties that blurred class lines. Now, one thing people don't understand is organizing a strike is extremely difficult. It's not the same thing as a riot. A strike is a peaceful, civil disobedient protest. And it's really hard to organize that because you make sure you gotta go get food, get water, still have money coming in, be able to afford to live. Sometimes they camp out outside the facility or somewhere not too far. And it's really just amazing they're able to pull a lot of the stuff off. And they rightfully deserve it. I mean, some of these workers are really underpaid, treated like shit. And it's why now today you're seeing the rise of, such things such as, like I said, the Amazon workers, the Starbucks workers, the now Verizon and others. They're all taking the same strategy. This is going on for a long time. So when they say, oh, this is not going to work, they don't know what they're doing. They're taking out this playbook right here. Exactly how to organize and exactly how to win. Even this might have stopped their labor militancy and the rise of class consciousness, Dolly says, if not for the fact that, quote, an entire generation was sidetracked in the 1860s because of the Civil War, end quote. Northern wage earners who rallied to the Union cause became allied with their employers. National issues took over from class issues, quote, at a time when scores of industrial communities like Lynn were seething with resistance to industrialism. National politics were preoccupied with the issues of war and Reconstruction, end quote. And so none of these issues, the political parties took positions, offered choices, obscured the fact that the political system itself and the wealthy class it represented were responsible for the problems they now offered to solve. Class consciousness was overwhelmed during the Civil War, both North and South, by military and political unity and the crisis of war. That unity was weaned by rhetoric and enforced by arms. It was a war proclaimed as a war for liberty. By working people would be attacked by soldiers if they dared to strike. Indians would be massacred in Colorado by the U.S. Army, and those daring to criticize Lincoln's policies would be put in jail without trial. Perhaps 30,000 political prisoners. So if you don't know, during the Civil War, Lincoln actually suspended habeas corpus and threw a lot of his political enemies in prison, which was not a good idea. And he never should have done that, but that was the time he was in, and that's what he wanted to do. Still, there were signs on both sections of dissent from that unity, anger poor against rich, rebelling against the dominant political and economic forces. In the North, the war brought higher prices for food and the necessities of life. Prices of milk, eggs, and cheese were up to 60 to 100% for families that had not been able to pay the old prices. One historian, Emerson Fite, social and industrial conditions in the North during the Civil War, described the war situation, quote, employers were wont to appropriate to themselves all or nearly all the profits accruing from the higher prices, without being willing to grant to the employees a fair share of these profits through the medium of higher wages. There were strikes all over the country during the war. The Springfield Republic in 1863 said that, quote, the workmen of almost every branch of trade had had their strikes within the last few months, end quote. And the San Francisco Evening Bulletin said, quote, striking for higher wages is now the rage among the working people of San Francisco, end quote. Unions were being formed as a result of these strikes. Philadelphia shoemakers in 1863 announced the high prices made organization imperative. The headlines in Fisher's Trades Review on November 21st, 1863, quote, the revolution in New York, end quote, was an exaggeration, but its list of labor activities was impressive evidence of the hidden resentments of the poor during the war. The upheaval of the laboring masses in New York has startled the capitalists of the city and vicinity. The machinists are making a loyal stand. We published their appeal on another column. The city railroad employees struck for higher wages and made the whole population for a few days, quote, ride on Shank's mare. The house pinchers of Brooklyn had taken steps to counteract the attempt of the houses to reduce their wages. The house carpenters we are informed, are pretty well, quote, out of the woods, end quote, and the demands are generally compiled with. The safe makers have obtained an increase in wages and are now at work. The lithographic printers are making efforts to secure better pay for the labor. The workmen on the ironclads are yet holding out against the contractors. The window shade painters have obtained an advance of 25%. The horseshoes are fortifying themselves against the evils of money and trade fluctuations. The sash and blind makers are organizing their employees for 25% additional. The sugar factors are remodeling the list of prices. The glass cutters demand 15% of wages. Imperfect as we confessed our list to be, there is enough to convince the reader and that the social revolution now working its way through the land most successful if working men are only true to each other. The stage drivers, to the number of 800, are on strike. The working men of Boston are not behind, in addition to the strike at the Charlestown Navy Yard. The riggers are on strike,
As this writing is as rumored, says the Boston Post, that a general strike had come contemplated among the workmen and the iron establishments at South Boston and other parts of the city. The war brought many women into shops and factories, often over the objections of men who saw them driving wages downscale. And New York City girls sewed umbrellas from 6 in the morning to midnight, earning $3 a week, from which employers deducted the cost of needles and thread. Girls who made cotton shirts receiving 24 cents for a 12-hour day. In 1863, New York working women held a mass meeting to find a solution to their problems. A working women's protective union was formed, and there was a strike of women umbrella workers in New York and Brooklyn. And Providence, Rhode Island, a ladies' cigar makers union was organized. Altogether, by 1864, around 200,000 workers, men and women, were in trade unions, forming national unions in some of these trades, putting out labor newspapers. Union troops were used to break strikes. Federal soldiers were sent to Cold Springs, New York, to end a strike at gun workers, where workers wanted a wage increase. Striking mechanics, machinists, and tailors in St. Louis were forced to back to work by an army. In Tennessee, a Union general arrested and sent out the state 200 striking mechanics. When engineers on the Reading Railroad struck, troops broke that strike, as they did with miners in Tioga County, Pennsylvania. White workers in the North were not enthusiastic about a war which seemed to be fought for the black slave, or for the capitalist, for anyone but them. They worked in semi-slave conditions themselves. They thought the war was profiting the new class of millionaires. They saw defective guns sold to the army by contractors, sand sold as sugar, rye sold as coffee, shop sweeping made into clothing and blankets, paper sole shoes produced for soldiers at the front, navy ships made of rotting timbers, soldiers' uniforms that fell apart in the rain. The Irish working people of New York, recent immigrants, poor, looked upon with contempt by Native Americans, could hardly find sympathy for the black population of that city, who competed with them for jobs as longshoresmen, barbers, waiters, domestic servants. Blacks pushed out these jobs. Often were used to break strikes. Then came the war, the draft, the chance of death, and the conscription of Act of 1863, provided that the rich could avoid military service. They could pay $100 or buy a substitute. And the summer of 1863, a quote, Song of the Conscripts was circulated by the thousands of New York and other cities. One stanza: "We're coming, Father Abraham, there 300,000 more. We have more our bones and fists and four sides, with bleeding hearts and sword. Since poverty has been our crime, we bowed to thy decree. We are the poor and have no wealth to purchase liberty." When recruiting for the army began in July 1863, a mob in New York were at the main recruiting station. Then, for 3 days, crowds of white workers marched throughout the city, destroying buildings, factories, streetcar lines, homes. The draft riots were complete. Anti-black, anti-rich, and anti-Republican. From an assault on draft headquarters, the rioters went on to attacks on wealthy homes. In the murder of blacks, they marched through the streets, forcing factories to close. Recruiting more members of the mob, they set the city's colored orphan asylum on fire. They shot, burned, and hanged blacks found in the streets. Many people were thrown into the rivers to drown. All right, guys, I'm gonna leave it off there. I wanted to finish it, but there's still a bit more to go. I will be finishing this probably tomorrow or sometime this week, and then starting chapter 11 the next time. When chapters are going to be roughly over 40 pages, depending on the deck, I probably get 20 done, the next day 20 done. But when it's over 40 pages, it'll most likely be split into 3 parts. But other than that, I hope you guys are enjoying this reading so far and are really learning a lot. I have certainly learned a lot myself from, different social movements, labor movements, electoral politics, to everyday life of citizens, slaves, Native Americans that you frankly might not be taught in school. And I think this is a great time to keep you relaxed while also educating on something extremely important in American history. But other than that, I hope you guys are having a great day, had a wonderful weekend, and see you next time.